Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. This is the second webinar in our COP27 prep series. My name is Tim Carter. I'm coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's the ancestral and unceded lands of the Nipmuc, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag peoples. We always want to start by just recognizing the contribution that Indigenous communities have made and continue to make to the climate work that we all are a part of, and the largely extractive relationship we have had to the land since that time, and know that there's a lot of opportunity to do restorative and reparative action to help with the work in allyship with Indigenous communities going forward. We're going to do a few things here in preparation for the panelists, but we're really excited, first of all, just to recognize that this is the second in a series done in partnership with the University Climate Change Coalition and the Ringo constituency. I'm part of Second Nature, but this is a joint effort. We do it all together. We have one thing that Second Nature is doing is we get closer and closer to COP. Many of you either might be attending and that's why you're on here, or you're just interested in knowing about the COP. Is we would love to know if you're actually going to go. And so if Mia, if you could drop in the chat a little form that we have, we would love to, if you could fill out this form and let us know the dates you'll be attending. We'll have actually 4 staff members there. Some of the people in the panel I think are going to be there, and so we'd love to connect with you in person there. It looks like on Friday, November 11th, we'll be having a higher education reception, and would love to see you there. So with that, let's see. So this is the title of this one. So we had one a few weeks ago. This one is called Engaging with the UNFCCC, COPs, Bodies, and Issues. We were tempted to just call it the body issue, but that didn't seem to be the most appropriate thing. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, and there's more people on this than there was on the last one. So I'm going to move through these introduction slides fairly quickly. Just want to let everyone know it's being recorded, and we post those recordings online. Hopefully you'll be able to access the first one as well. Please ask questions. We're going to have time at the end for questions. Use the Q&A function in Zoom. You should know how to do that, but there's a little Q&A box at the bottom. You can add them at any time, and everybody's muted, so you can't say anything. So that's the only place you're going to get your voice heard, is stick it in the Q&A. I think the chat is also set up if you want to say something in the chat. That could be for more discussion back and forth, but we'll be monitoring the Q&A for questions. And then that's it. So we're going to get going, dive right in. We have 4 wonderful speakers, Ingrid Timbo, Zoha Shawu, Marilyn Averill, and Tracy Bach. And I'm going to turn it over now to Marilyn, who's going to be kicking us off. Marilyn, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome, everyone. Greetings to you. This webinar is intended to help people who follow the international climate negotiations to understand that the annual Conference of the Parties meetings may not be the best place to really learn in depth about issues that are under negotiation. The fact is that most of the work of the UNFCCC is done outside of the COPs by subsidiary bodies, constituted bodies, a secretariat, by expert consultants and others. And their work informs the COP about various issues. That work's done intersessionally between the COPs. You'll have a much easier time understanding and following what is happening at the COP if you take some time to identify an issue of interest to you and try to figure out what's been happening with that issue over the last year. So we're going to present some of the UNFCCC bodies, as Tim said, that address different climate change issues. I'm going to start off by talking about the subsidiary bodies, or SBs. Then Tracy Bach will be talking about constituted bodies. And then Ingrid, Zoha, Tracy, and I will each take one of the constituted bodies and give you some idea of the kind of work that they do. So thank you for putting up the slide. So this webinar is going to, let's see, let me just move this over here. Enhance understanding of how the subsidiary bodies and constituted bodies support the work of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. We're hoping to increase observer engagement with UNFCCC outside of the COPs. Next slide, please. So there are 5 types of UNFCCC bodies listed here. I'll talk about some of them in a minute. The first is the Conference of the Parties, which is going to be putting on COP27, which many of you will be attending. The Bureau is all about process management, and we're not going to talk about that tonight. The Secretariat provides organizational support and technical expertise to the COP, and the Secretariat is incredibly important. It does a whole lot of the heavy lifting for the COP and does a lot of the intersessional work. The permanent subsidiary bodies I'll be talking about, and then Tracy will cover the CBs, or the constituted bodies. Next slide, please. So first, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the supreme body under the Framework Convention. That's the way it's described in the Framework Convention. And it includes all of the countries that have ratified the UNFCCC. There are now 198 of them, essentially, almost all of the countries of the world. And it's the COP that makes the decisions under the UNFCCC. It meets annually. That's what the COPs are all about. And similar bodies make decisions for protocols created under the UNFCCC. That's the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So let's start with one of the 2 permanent subsidiary bodies, the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice. We call it the SUBSTA. And the SUBSTA provides timely information and advice on scientific and technological matters relating to the convention. The UNFCCC defines 5 tasks for them and authorizes the COPs to set up more as they are needed. The really important function of the SUBSTA is that it really links science to policy needs. That's you can't overstate how important that is, to say that we need to have policies that are linked to sound science. The current key areas of work for the SUBSTA include impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation relating to climate change, promoting development and transfer of environmentally sound technologies, improving guidelines for greenhouse gas emission inventories, and promoting collaboration on research and systematic observation. Next slide, please. So the Subsidiary Body for Implementation, or the SBI, is the other permanent subsidiary body. And the SBI assists the COP in the assessment and review of effective implementation of the convention. They're assigned 3 tasks, including to assist the COP as appropriate in the preparation and implementation of its decisions. The key building blocks that the SBI builds on are transparency, mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building. Next slide, please. So the SUBSTA and the SBI, the 2 permanent subsidiary bodies, meet concurrently twice a year. They meet at the COP. They'll be meeting during the COP in Egypt, and in May or June in Bonn, Germany. We call those Bonn, Germany meetings the subsidiary body meetings, or the SBs. The SBI and the SUBSTA work separately on some issues and together on many cross-cutting issues. They provide annual reports on their work to the COP, and much of the work of the constituted bodies is actually reported through the SBs. The SB chairs are right now drafting scenario notes for COP27 to suggest possible ways forward on issues under negotiation. When those come out, they're really helpful for you to read through, because they really do focus on the current status of negotiations, the suggestions that the SB chairs are making for directions for the negotiations, and you'll learn a lot by reading through those. And there'll be many references to them during the COP, so it's good to be familiar with those scenario notes. Next slide. The provisional agendas are available now for COP27, for SUB 57, and SBI 57. The link is here, and be sure to read the section with annotations. It'll tell you a lot about what's going to be happening at the COP and with the SBI and SUBSTA meetings. And it also provides links to documents that'll be very helpful to you. So I'm going to turn this over to Tracy Bach, who is one of the two focal points for the research and independent NGOs, the RINGOs, the constituency that many of us belong to. So Tracy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Marilyn. It's wonderful to follow Marilyn. She's actually the person who brought me into Ringo and made me feel welcome. So thank you, Marilyn. Everybody on this panel, just by the way, has been to many COPs. I actually asked people to tout it up beforehand, but I'm sure it's more than 20. So there's a lot of experience that goes into this presentation tonight, which is really focusing on the year-round activity that happens that supports the COPs. And so I'm going to spend some time, I think I only have 2 slides at this point, and I'm going to spend some time because this visual, I think, helps put Marilyn's description of governance structure, and in particular, the permanent subsidiary bodies in perspective with what is now become a small growth industry, of constituted bodies. So so let's just slow down for a moment and look at the right-hand side of this graphic. I feel like I could be doing a play-by-play of a sporting match, right? So it gives you a way of looking at the incredible detail, right, that is thrown at us, especially if you're new to this. So one, as Marilyn said, the plenary bodies are those COPs, which is a Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention. There's also a Conference of Parties of the Kyoto Protocol, that's the CMP, that you'll see in pink on the right, and of the COP of the Paris Agreement Parties, which is the CMA. And I like to think of them as this quasi-legislative body that comes together once a year. So there's only one COP, CMA, and CMP each year, and that's, as Marilyn said, in November, sometimes early December. And so they need subsidiary bodies to do the nitty-gritty of processing the many, many mandates that they ask of each other as a legislative body. So that's where SBI and SBSTA come in. So what you see on this graphic then with these arrows are the relationship to SBI and SBSTA. So all 3 treaties rely on SBI and SBSTA, like Marilyn said. But because questions have become increasingly, we could say, complex, technical, one could even say politically fraught, these constituted bodies have been constituted, created by COP decisions with increasing frequency since essentially post-Copenhagen, since Cancun. So I want to walk through the middle part of this graph. So we've gone through plenary bodies, we've skipped that bureau, although happy to answer questions about it. We've touched on the permanent subsidiary bodies. Now look at the constituted bodies level. Here's what you see. 1, some constituted bodies, many, were created under the COP, the Framework Convention. And then when the Paris Agreement was adopted and then came into force so very quickly, that they were then under a COP decision asked as a constituted body to also, quote, serve the Paris Agreement. So examples of that are in green here on this slide. The Adaptation Committee, which Ingrid is going to talk about next. The Standing Committee on Finance, which I'll come back and give you some on-the-ground views of. I'll skip down to that technology mechanism, particularly the Technology Executive Committee. Marilyn's going to come back and talk about that. And then if you look at the first one in blue below the COP, the what we call the WIM-XCOM, which is the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, Zoha is going to come in and talk about that specifically. Because what I'm doing is giving you the bigger picture of what they do and how they fit into the governance structure. But I think it's much more interesting to hear the details of specific ones on the ground. I'm going to skip the rest here. Happy to answer questions. Zoha, could I have the next slide? Thank you so much. So here's the takeaways that I'd like you to have overall about constituted bodies. 1, they are ad hoc, meaning they're formed, not quite on the fly, but out of a COP decision. They are not standing bodies like the SBI and SBSTA, which are actually created as part of the treaty language itself. It's not a bad thing. It's just, it's not a good thing. You know, it actually is a good thing. It's a recognition by the COP that they need to spend more time on certain topics. So the second point, as I just said, all constituted bodies have been created by specific decisions, and they have a mandate. And that's really important to know, because sometimes you will wonder, well, why aren't they covering carbon financing, for example? Well, that wasn't part of the Standing Committee on Finance mandate. So it's very important to be able to go back and understand how the bodies were formed and who are on them, which is the third takeaway. They have a defined membership and a defined leadership. Typically, it's balanced between developed and developing countries, both membership and leadership. And then fourth, they have subscribed work products, and the COP decision says what they're looking for and essentially assigns them homework. As Marilyn said, just like the SBI and SUBSTA meet twice a year, most of the current constituted bodies meet twice, sometimes 3 times. So they meet throughout the year. You can attend virtually these days, really all of them. I should probably say almost all of them to hedge my bets. So I would argue to you these last 2 points. One, if you're going to really understand the COP agenda that you want to be a part of and to attend, my timer just went off, you really have to go to those agenda items and understand if there is a constituted body that works on those issues. Because then the next step is to go to these 2 parts of the UNFCCC website that I've taken screenshots on the right for you. When you land at the home page and you have the choice of process and meetings. If you go down to the subpoint on bodies, and then beneath that, it will start to list, if you scroll down, the constituted bodies and list them alphabetically. It's a great and actually easy first stop to find out, 1, the whole plethora of bodies. 2, you have links then to the specific web pages that do exist on the UNFCCC website for each body. Last thing I just want to point out, and I'll come back to it in my little bit on the SCF, that these meetings do take place throughout the year. Like I mentioned, this year, the SCF is doing 3 times. And I want to say to you is not only attending these, or at least reading their agendas, and sometimes you can watch videos of what happened at them, and certainly their work product that is always linked to their websites, their web pages. In addition to that, you could also have opportunities to use your expertise to support them. They're always looking for essentially pro bono work. And you can also make submissions on specific questions that they're asking. That's it for me, I think. Can you just go to the next slide, Zoha, to make sure I didn't? Yeah, great. So now I have the wonderful opportunity to introduce one of my favorite Ringo members, Ingrid Timbo, who is Policy Director of AGWA. It's the best, I think, acronym ever, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And because of her expertise in water specifically, she works on a lot of adaptation issues. So now this part of the webinar tonight, we're going to go in an order with each 4 of us, and we're going to put on the ground what a constituted body looks like, how it operates, and how it's going to factor into the COP27 and CMA4 agendas in November. Take it away, Ingrid.
Excellent. Thank you, Tracy, so much for that introduction and for kind of teeing up the overall picture. Like Tracy mentioned, my name is Ingrid Timbo. And first, I just want to thank Second Nature, the University Climate Change Coalition, and my Ringo family for having me here today to talk just very, very briefly about one of the committees whose work I follow very closely, and that's the Adaptation Committee. Thankfully for me, because I live in acronym soup, Adaptation Committee is one of the most straightforward, or at least in terms of name, of the various different bodies of the UNFCCC, and that they work on adaptation, as you would imagine. So they were established in response to a 2010 COP decision to formulate and implement national adaptation plans. So helping countries or parties in UNFCCC language implement national adaptation plans in order to enable countries to identify both medium and long-term adaptation needs, and to develop and implement strategies and programs to address those needs. So the Adaptation Committee currently consists of 16 members. As you can see on this slide, here's a virtual shot of the group from, I think it's a couple years ago, not super up to date, but 16 members representing 6 continents, No representatives from Antarctica yet, but there's still time. And so these 16 members meet, as Tracy mentioned, twice a year, and they are supported by the UNFCCC Secretariat. So there are experts within the UNFCCC that support the Adaptation Committee's work throughout the year. And so they meet in the spring and fall. They also organize an annual adaptation forum. And they engage with another event called the NAP Expo. And information about all of these are on the Adaptation Committee website, and I am happy to put that in the chat after this. They also organize webinars on adaptation-related topics, and they work with their fellow constituted bodies on overlapping issues, such as capacity building or finance for least developed countries, etc. So they are their own entity, but they also work collaboratively and pretty closely, I would say, at least in recent years, with the other constituted bodies. So as Tracy also mentioned, these bodies are constituted and that they have a mandate. So they have specific things that they work on. In terms of the Adaptation Committee, their mandate, or they work on a 3-year flexible work plan. And there are 2 ways. There's both the mandate from the COP or the CMA as to things that they should work on. So for example, right now, one of the things that the Adaptation Committee is working on is developing guidelines for adaptation communications. And adaptation communications are the way that parties report back to the COP on what they are doing at the national level to adapt to climate change. And so the Adaptation Committee is tasked with putting out guidelines for these adaptation communications. So that's something that comes from a COP mandate. But also, they can also come up with agenda items or things that they're working on that originate from their own consideration. So they do have a little bit of flexibility there. So there are 5 things. Thank you for the next slide. There are 5 different kind of mandated things that they work on. They provide technical support and guidance to the parties. They share relevant information. So this is where you all come in. Folks who are working on climate change can share your projects. We do all the time what we're working on, and they try and collate and put out reports that share best practices. They formulate their own recommendations, drawing on good practices, again, from civil society, and they consider information communicated by parties on monitoring and evaluation and review. So these are just some of the things that the AC is working on. Next slide, please. This is kind of their most recent report. So looking at the landscape of support for formulating and national adaptation plans, which a number of countries are doing right now. 38 have submitted their national adaptation plans, but over 100 countries now are working on a national adaptation strategy. And so the Adaptation Committee is supporting parties as they do this process. So I'll put the link for this in the chat as well if you want to learn more information. But just to say that they are one of those bodies that does engage a lot with civil society. I'm able to attend these meetings. I'm able to engage with them. And they happen outside of the annual COP meeting. And so again, as both Tracy and Marilyn mentioned, it's really important to think about these other types of meetings throughout the year, because that's really where you'll have a better chance to engage with these types of members. So I'm gonna stop it there, but if you have questions about Adaptation Committee, I'm happy to answer them during the chat time. Thank you.
Great. So it's back to me. And that's because I've been attending the Standing Committee on Finance, or SCF, meetings for some time. Like the Adaptation Committee, the SCF was created by a decision. And you'll see also at COP16, Cancun was a very active time for seating constituted bodies. And we could talk about that. I'd be happy to. And just like the AC has a mission, so does the SCF, and it's to assist the COP in exercising its functions in relation to the financial mechanism of the convention. And so that includes improving essentially coherence in delivering climate change financing, because there's multiple funds involved or operating entities. And along that line, rationalization of the financial mechanism. They also have the task of mobilizing or mobilization of financial resources, and importantly, MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification of support provided to developing countries by developed country parties. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the Standing Committee on Finance right now. This is a retreat at their last meeting in South Africa. And what you'll see, it's a diverse group of people. It is deliberately set up when it was constituted in the COP decision from 2016 to have 10 members from developed countries and 10 members from developing countries. Likewise, there are 2 co-chairs, one each from a developed and developing country. Currently, the 2 co-chairs are from South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, and Austria / the EU. So on the left-hand side, I wanted to point out that I think fundamentally, the SCF has a lot of work on its plate, because you can imagine there are a lot of finance questions that are on the formal agenda, not only of the COP agenda, but the Paris Agreement, the CMA agenda as well. So one of the ones that you'll most hear about is this biennial assessment. So every 2 years, an overview of the climate finance flows. And basically and so you can see, I put in here, not to be too picky, but I wanted you to see how that mandate for that product came out of a decision at a subsequent COP, at COP 17. This is one to watch, especially if you are following finance issues, because the BA now is getting up to its 5th iteration. And this committee is essentially, like, if I think of Congress in the United States and I think of the Ways and Means or the Finance Committee, right, they're in the trenches. And so likewise, the SCF is looking through the OECD numbers. They're looking at reporting that's coming through the convention itself, like biennial reports and biennial update reports under the Paris Agreement. They'll look at BTRs, et cetera. And they're really crunching the numbers and to see if indeed finance is flowing to low carbon lifestyles. I'm going to jump down. They're working on, believe it or not, a definition of climate finance. If you don't follow this, it would seem kind of simplistic, but it's very contested. Most recently, last year, they did a determination of the needs of developing country parties. These are finance needs. And you can imagine that that is part of the information that goes into calculating this new collective quantified finance goal, which would succeed the 100 million goal that we've talked about for years. And also they are looking at every year they are charged as a governance function of giving guidance to these operating entities of the financial mechanism. And that's the financial mechanism. 2 main operating entities are the GEF and the GCF. Next slide, please. So you're at COP. And you are asking the question that many are asking, which is, show me the money, right? So where on the agenda does that occur? Well, if you look on the left, this is a screenshot, and I apologize for its small type and blurriness, but this is the current, it's the preliminary, it's not the final, this is the proposed agenda for the COP. And this is just a snapshot of it. There are agenda items before 7, as you can see on the left, and there are ones after 13. But I wanted you to see that agenda item 8 on the COP agenda is all about matters relating to finance. And right on there, you'll see 8B is matters relating to the SCF. You'll see guidance under C. That's guidance to the Green Climate Fund and guidance to the GEF under D. So my point being is that these agenda items relate directly to those products. You can see the same happening where I put the red arrows on the CMA4. So for the last slide, my 5 minutes of fame is up on the SCF. I wanted you to see this is the most recent SCF meeting agenda. It just happened last week in Australia in connection with the SCF forum. And you can see here the products that I was talking about that it delivers to the COP to help the COP make good finance decisions, I should say informed is my definition of good finance decisions. You can see how this agenda relates so clearly to what you're going to see on finance in Sharm el-Sheikh under the COP and the CMA agenda. Now I'll pass it back to Marilyn, who will talk about the technology mechanism and specifically the Technology Executive Committee. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy. Technology, let's see. Technology has been recognized as a major issue from the very beginning of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In 1992, the Framework Convention, Article 4, Paragraph 5 addressed the promotion, facilitation, and financing of environmentally sound technologies and know-how. So notice that we've got technology and financing in the same article and paragraph here. They tend to go together, and I'm going to talk a little more about that later. In 2001, the technology framework was created by the COP to implement Article 4, Paragraph 5 from the Framework Convention. And then in 2010, the COP established a technology mechanism. This is something new, and it involves two bodies. There's a policy arm that involves the Technology Executive Committee, or the TEC, which is the group that I'm going to be talking about, and an implementation arm, which is the Climate Technology Center and Network, CTCN, which I'm not going to talk about after this. Next slide, please. So hold on a second. The TEC has a mandate like every other constituted body, and theirs is essentially to enhance climate technology development and transfer. There are 7 functions for enhancement that are listed for the TEC, including to provide an overview of technological needs and analysis of policy and technical issues, consider and recommend actions, recommend guidance on policies and program priorities, promote and facilitate collaboration, recommend actions to address the barriers to climate technology development and transfer, seek cooperation and promote coherence and cooperation. And this really refers to all kinds of different groups, everything from other governmental groups to the private sector to any kind of stakeholder, and catalyze the development and use of technology roadmaps or action plans. Next slide, please. So as Ingrid and Tracy have said, constituencies like the RINGOs, the Research and Independent NGOs, may send representatives to TEC meetings. Typically, there are 2 meetings a year. They're frequently in Bonn, but I noticed that the next one is going to be in Sangdo, Korea. So they're reaching out to a different geographical area. And the civil society constituencies, the 9 of them, may send representatives to TEC meetings. Meetings and relevant documents are available online. But there's one way in which the TEC is a little different from other constituted bodies in the way it allows observers to engage with their work. The TEC has a number of task forces that are appointed to carry out specific tasks under the TEC rolling work plan. The task forces change from time to time. We're just at the end of one rolling work plan. We're about to adopt another one, so the task forces are likely to change. But some of the observer constituencies have been invited to appoint a representative each of those task forces, or the TEC task forces. And this is something that I don't think many of the constituted bodies have done, to really allow observers to come in and help with the work. Observers are treated as working members of the task forces, and we participate in planning, document review, and other tasks that come up for each of the task force. Observers are not, however, involved in formal TEC decisions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little about how you can engage with technology, with the TEC and with technology in general. First of all, read the Joint TEC CTCN annual report. It'll tell you what's been going on over the last year with respect to technology within the UNFCCC system. Read summaries of recent meetings like TEC 25 that occurred in Bonn in early September, or even watch the meetings online. recordings are available to you. Browse through the reports and other materials, like Tracy showed you some of the reports that the Standing Committee on Finance has put together. And then skim COP27 provisional agendas for items that address technology and follow links to relevant materials. And there's a link here to the tech and CTN materials on the TT Clear website. If you just put in UNFCCC and TT Clear, or even UNFCCC and PEC for tech, you'll get to their website. So next slide, please. This is just an example of what you can do to link up. This is similar to what Tracy just showed you. That this is a way of linking tech work to SBI 57 and 27. And frankly, there's not as much technological work going on at 27 as there's been at a couple of recent COPs. But here's one particular issue. At Tech 25 in September, they received a draft policy brief on experiences and lessons learned from support for climate technologies provided by the operating entities of the financial mechanism. Again, we were working with the Standing Committee on Finance on issues relating to technologies. And if you look at the SBI 57 provisional agenda, it has an item on this particular policy brief and the recommendations that came out of it, and recommends action to the COP regarding this overlap or the coordination of support for climate technologies provided by operating entities of the financial mechanism. I'll stop there and turn this over to Zoha Shawu. Zoha is with the Stockholm Environment Institute in their Boston office, and tell you about another constituted body.
Thank you. I hope you all can see and hear me. So I'm going to talk to you about the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. So this was established at COP19 in Warsaw, Poland in November of 2013, and it was established by the COP, and so it's governed by the COP. And the purpose of the WIM is to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change, including both extreme weather events as well as slow onset events in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And it's interesting that this language actually says it aims to address loss and damage, because if you're familiar with the topic of loss and damage, you may know that the Paris Agreement article on loss and damage actually introduces the language of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, which is particularly controversial because a lot of developing countries have argued that averting is kind of covered under mitigation and minimizing is covered under adaptation, and so we should be focusing on addressing. And so it's just interesting that that the WIM language actually only has addressing in there. So there are three key functions of the WIM. The first is really to enhance knowledge and understanding of different approaches to addressing loss and damage. The second is around enhancing dialogue or strengthening dialogue, coordination, and coherence among different stakeholders. And the third is to enhance action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address loss and damage and enable countries to take actions. And a lot of developing countries have argued that while the WIM has to a certain extent fulfilled the first two functions on knowledge and coordination, the third on action and support has been particularly lacking in its work thus far. So the executive committee, or the EXCOM, is the body that guides the implementation of these functions of the WIM, and it reports annually to the COP. It is often phrased by people as the political arm of the WIM, and most of its work focuses quite a lot on that first function on knowledge, enhancing knowledge particularly. So it consists of 20 members, which is, I believe it's a balance between developed and developing country party representatives. They meet at least twice a year in a setting that is open to observers to attend, and parties provide guidance to the EXCOM once a year. And the current rolling work plan plan of the XCOM was endorsed at COP23. And it includes these 5 strategic work streams, which are kind of aligned with the functions that I had mentioned earlier, but also includes specific things such as a work stream on slow onset events and one on non-economic losses and damages as well, and then on human mobility, migration, displacement, and so on, in addition to comprehensive risk management and action and support. And each of these work streams is associated with its own expert group, which is responsible for carrying out the thematic work under these different work streams, and members of the XCOM are part of different expert groups related to these 5 work streams. So that's kind of the political arm of the WIM. You may have also heard recently that the technical arm of the WIM has kind of been established, known as the Santiago Network of Loss and Damage. So that is a body that is under the WIM, but not under the XCOM, if that makes sense. And the purpose of that body is really to provide technical support and guidance on the ground to communities that have been facing losses and damages. And so that's primarily focusing on the coordination function of the WIM that I had mentioned, as well as action and support. So the body was really formed following these critiques that I mentioned about the WIM not sufficiently fulfilling its functions on action and support. And so it really aims to do this to capacity building activities on the ground and really form networks that link different organizations and bodies on the ground to each other to enhance sharing of knowledge and coordination, and so on. So moving on to the agenda. So the COP27 provisional agenda includes an agenda item on the Warsaw International Mechanism for loss and damage, as well as so that will mainly focus on the report of the XCOM to the COP, the annual report, and then you have the matters relating to finance agenda item, which Tracy had mentioned, and this includes a sub-agenda item on matters relating to funding arrangements for addressing loss and damage. And if you're familiar with loss and damage as a topic, you'll probably know that financing for loss and damage is something that is particularly quite controversial and has been a big push and key demand by a lot of developing countries in the past few years. And so, although this item is on the provisional agenda, there are some suspicions or speculations about the extent to which it will be adopted in this matter and stay on the agenda. But we know that a lot of developing countries are coming into the COP with a strong push and a demand for establishing a new financial facility for loss and damage, and so such a decision could emerge from this sub-agenda item if it is actually adopted in this way. And then so this agenda items on the WIM and finance are also part of the CMA agenda, because as Tracy mentioned, and I think the text here states that the WIM shall be subject to the authority and guidance of the CMA and may be enhanced and strengthened as determined by the CMA. So even though the WIM is governed only by the COP, it is also on the CMA agenda for that reason. And then the Santiago Network, which I mentioned, is primarily negotiated through the SVs. And so the negotiations of the Santiago Network this year will primarily be focusing on its operational modalities for actually fully operationalizing it. So far, the negotiations have primarily focused on the actual functions of the Santiago Network, but now we'll be going more into the structures and modalities of how it will actually work. And yeah, I think I will stop here unless there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll pass directly back for the Q&A round.
Yep, I think we're going to get started on Q&A. So let's bring everybody back on here. Thanks so much. That was so great. There's so much, structure and content that you have to be paying attention to. And it made me think, and then one of the questions kind of alluded to this. Sometimes we just think, well, there's all this support for why aren't things happening faster? And I thought, well, how are these things staffed? Like, who's paying for this? And are the people that are part of these constituent bodies or the these executive committees or standing committees, are they government representatives? Are they volunteers? Are they, they're having to make decisions by consensus? Do they decide their own way of doing that? How do you think about like how staffing works? Because that might address like how progress does or doesn't get made. And we've alluded to it a little bit in some of these areas, but some might be different than others. So I'd love to hear what the panel thinks about that question of staffing.
Everybody going to be quiet? Oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I'll turn this over to Tracy before I'm finished, because I think that you have so much contact with the Secretariat and with the general structure that you'll probably have more to say than I will. But the Secretariat really grounds all of this, and the Secretariat has, every one of these constituted bodies and subsidiary bodies has their own little Secretariat team. It's not so little. It might be a dozen people, or some of them have fewer than that. Some may have more. Those are paid for by the parties, by the countries that have signed on to the UNFCCC. Essentially, all of the support is from the parties and from their contributions to the budget of the UNFCCC. But they also contract with a lot of experts, so that money also comes from the parties. But Tim, you were also asking about the members of the constituted bodies themselves and who pays for those, and I think it varies. For Annex 1 countries, the developed countries, they're likely to have to pay for their own people to go to meetings for all of those expenses. But for people who are members of the constituted bodies or subsidiary bodies from developing countries, their expenses typically are covered by the COPs. But Tracy, I'll turn it over to you, because you may have more specific information than I do.
You did a beautiful job, Marilyn. It does come out of the budget. And the one thing I'd add is that there have been a lot of budget pressures over the last few years. So there's an initiative not to hire new staff so much, right? Regular staff, like all budget pressured organizations do. So I see a lot more contracted personnel, experts. Oh, good. Ingrid, you want to add?
Just very quickly to give a concrete example from the Adaptation Committee, not in terms of the finance, but just in terms of the members, in terms of how much they have going on. So one of the previous co-chairs of the Adaptation Committee, in addition to serving on the Adaptation Committee, she's also the lead negotiator for her country, which was also representing the negotiating group G77 plus China in the actual formal negotiation processes. On top of that, she's a university professor, working like 2 different jobs, and then also supporting their government on a number of different because she's also a technical expert in her field, also supporting her government on a range of technical things. And so when you think about the people who are serving on these committees, she's not an extraordinary example. She's an extraordinary person, but everybody has, a million different things that they're working on and those sorts of things. And so sometimes it is difficult to make progress, not only because of financial related issues, but just because of the time that the members have themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like almost a full-time job for the committees if they wanted to take on these topics, let alone you've got 30 other things on your plate. So it's kind of remarkable that they can produce these reports and make the progress that they have. Yeah. I did want to pivot a little bit to some of these questions, and one kind of grouping of questions is around the relationship between what you had described as part of the COP, ecosystem, and then these other international environmental activities that are happening. So, like, there's, I think, one question about the IPCC. So, how does it relate to the science? There's the reference to the UN high-level political forum that meets around various SDGs and other topics, obviously. So how does does this work fit into kind of broader connected work with other things that are happening in global environmental space? Is there any formal relationship, or is all just kind of similar people, or what's that look like?
Well, I'll jump in there just quickly because I saw the questions about SDGs and COPs, and then one about the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and their COPs, and then on SBSTA and the IPCC relationship. So one, think about SBI and SBSTA are subcommittees of the COP. And so they're processing a lot of information to help the policymakers. For example, getting out the summary of policymakers on various assessment reports that the IPCC does. There is some overlap in the people who are involved in the IPCC. So for example, we have several RINGO members who are authors of various IPCC products. And they also are involved right now with the global stock take. They're involved with tech. They're involved with the PCCB. They're involved with the Standing Committee on Finance. So there is some overlap. But I guess the big takeaway I wanted to say in terms of those three questions is, one, they're separate entities, though, functionally. And the SDGs and the High Level Political Forum are part of the political decision-making of the UN, right, the UNGA. And if you look at SDG 13, it's all about climate change, even though there are other SDGs that are implicated or impacted by climate change. And if you look at SDG 13, most of the activity there says, go see the COPs, go do, so most of it references the work going on in the UNFCCC while also looking at where it touches on others. And then on the PA and COP bodies, why not merge them? That one is a simple one. It's the one word answer I give to my students. It's called sovereignty. And countries, when they ratify a treaty, give up a little bit of their sovereignty to be a part of that treaty. And so the way the Framework Convention is created is, it's not a given that if you adopt a protocol like the Kyoto Protocol, that all of the Framework Convention parties, the countries that ratified it, will agree to the Kyoto Protocol. A notable example was the United States, which ratified and was bound by the UNFCCC, but did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So that's why they're separate bodies, because each country has to agree to be a part of that treaty.
I just want to add one thing, which is that I think maybe all four of us, in talking about four of the constituted bodies, that the part of their mandate has to do with collaboration. And that collaboration usually involves collaborating, that constituted body needs to be collaborating with other constituted bodies, with the subsidiary bodies, but also with external organizations like the ones you mentioned, Tim, and particularly with other UN bodies. So it's kind of built into the mandates of most, if not all, of the constituted and subsidiary bodies.
Yeah.
I see Ingrid shaking her head. I just want to add, I didn't put it on my slides, but actually that's an agenda item of the SCF, that there are essentially liaisons to all the other constituted bodies and to folks outside, so that there is integration there.
Yeah. And I just to flag, some of the questions are around kind of some issues that might be coming up on COP27. And so teaser, next webinar on October 24th is where we'll address some of those key issues to watch. So come back for that one if you're interested in discussing, going more deeply. Zoha, I was actually interested in starting with you on this next one, and that is that the question was around the WIM negotiations and potentially ways that coercion could be used in those negotiations. And so I wanted to talk specifically about the WIM, but extrapolate that out to how do other committees avoid either, I don't know, conflicts or influence, or how could they be influenced, maybe in a positive way, beyond what was already discussed. Zoha, do you have any thoughts about that for WIM, and then others chime in on maybe some of your own committees that you're familiar? Ingrid, I was thinking, on the committee that you've been a participant, part of.
Oh, that's a big question, and I don't think I have a clear answer, but I think everything in the negotiations is fundamentally about power and power dynamics, right? And I think, you know, we do research on this too, about like the equity of climate negotiations themselves and how power dynamics play a role in shaping the outcomes that emerge from these negotiations. And, you know, as much as we try to keep the process neutral in some way, I think the external dynamics of the world often do permeate into the negotiations themselves. So for example, trade relationships or aid dependencies between countries can be used to influence certain countries to compromise or serve certain agendas, for example. And we do know, like for loss and damage, for example, the language around loss and damage not being a basis or liability or compensation in the Paris Agreement was kind of as a result of a give and take. It was a compromise that countries agreed to if 1.5 as the target made it in the Paris Agreement, right? And so that's just an example of how everything is kind of a give and take. And in terms of what we can do to deal with that, I mean, I know that now a lot of developing countries and CSOs are thinking very strategically about how they message certain things. And so, for example, for loss and damage, we're basically moving away from talking about liability or compensation at all and framing it more in terms of the need for solidarity and to address the needs that the losses and damages that countries are facing, and basically framing it more as, rather than saying you contributed the most and so you have to pay, it's more like we contributed the least and we're facing the damages and so we need support, you know, things like that, that basically you have to do to be able to move things forward. Don't know if that answers the question. But. No,
totally. Yeah, it's a great, perfect answer. And can you see that when you're attending these meetings, or do you have to kind of read under the, you know, read between the lines of that negotiations happened? We knew that was a, you know, infant that happened somewhere else or whatever, you know, like how do you think about, or how transparent is that? Anyone can answer that question.
I've been to very few COPs. I think I've probably the least experience of everyone here, but I think I find like the little huddles very interesting because on the surface it comes across as a very like equitable, transparent process, right? Where like, you know, everyone raises their hand and you have to intervene, and there needs to be full consensus to decide on anything. But then if you have all these huddles where not everybody is a part of them and not everyone can, you know, equally voice things, then that's just kind of undermines the whole process. And it's very funny that that's just such an accepted part of negotiations.
Yeah. We talked about that last time too, Tracy. I think I remember you mentioned the role of huddles, even almost formally. Is it formal? Are they official or no?
They will call a huddle when they're stuck. Okay. Co-facilitators. I would like to pull Ingrid in because she had one of those Cheshire cat grins on her face when answering that question, because I can tell you just very quickly in the SCF, there have been non-decisions on certain of those products that I listed because the 20 people in the room could not agree to a proposed recommended decision to the COP to take. So it does happen. But Ingrid, I saw you smiling because I'm sure the Adaptation Committee has quite a dynamic.
Oh, it definitely does. I mean, I would definitely say in compared to like the WIM is definitely, I think, the spiciest of the constituted bodies for sure. I think, you know, in the adaptation group, I would say there's a little bit more consensus, but definitely not always, because everything that's happening in those rooms, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the context of the political, you know, engagements that are happening both at the COP and outside of it. And I think this year is actually going to be really interesting to see how things go, because really we're moving so much away from a lot of formal negotiations and moving into implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that's where money becomes even more of an issue, and actually adaptation has been really foregrounded in a way, and again, that's it, means of implementation. How are we actually going to implement this? And so in the context of potentially a global recession and the crisis in Ukraine and food prices and inflation and all of these things, how is this all going to play into how things happen at COP27? It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, and then how that trickles down to the various different rooms that we're all sitting in.
And beyond what
Finance.
happens in our constituted bodies, Zoha teed up the agenda fight that's going to happen on the very first day at the opening plenary. So agendas are formed by countries, and every country has the right to put something on a preliminary agenda. And this loss and damage financing piece is going to stop, most likely, right? It's going to cause huddles, and they're going to have to find consensus on how to go forward on that item, whether it's part of the agenda or it's continue to negotiate whether it can be talked about on the agenda at some point in time. So newcomers will find that probably pretty interesting, that the agenda is not as set as they thought coming there.
Yep. Marilyn, you get the final word.
And people need to understand the consensus is the decision-making rule. That it doesn't mean unanimity, but it's pretty close. And so a few countries can keep something from happening pretty easily. With respect to transparency and constituted bodies, I mean, everything in the UNFCCC comes down to financing issues. Everything has costs, and there's just not enough money to do everything that needs to be done. So it's a major issue. It's a really political issue, and constituted bodies have the right to ask observers to leave the room. And when I used to go to the WIM meetings, there were a number of times when we were sent out into the hall so that they could speak confidentially. And it has occasionally happened with a tech, but most of the time it's about financial issues. It's about where's the money going to come from, and they're less likely to be open and transparent on those issues than on a lot of others.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Marilyn. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Zoha. Thanks, Ingrid. I want to say thank you too to Mia Sen, who did all the behind the scenes stuff. And you probably won't be able to see her, but she's there. Thank you, Mia. And thank you as an attendees. We, again, want to say that there's the third in this series coming up on Monday, October 24th. You can go to the Second Nature website to find that. And we really appreciate your time this evening. Have a good one, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.